So, we are going to discuss the different layers of viewing any visual from any culture in terms of the examples that we are collecting from Indian folk and minor art. This is a common way of looking at visuals, especially in the area of visual art, to break it into different sections and different layers. Either there are steps, or there are also instances where we look at them in different categories which are not placed in a linear pattern. For example, when we look at a narrative visual and try to interpret that in a four-stepped method prescribed by Feldman, which is very popular all over, there are steps like description, analysis, interpretation, and conclusion. So, in those four steps, what happens that we look at the visual, we try to describe what we get to see. Just to understand the arrangement, what are the things that are there, and it totally depends on an individual's observation. We may miss out on certain aspect that we get to see in our following views, but it's very important to be neutral and look at the visual and describe them without any judgment. So after that step, we get into the position to analyze all the images that we get to see, and then we are in a position to make comments whether the visual arrangement is appropriate or not. In a way, when we talk about the form, in the analysis part, we also talk about the form and content together to understand whether the content is matching with the form or not, or the kind of style that is a combination of form and content, whether the style is appropriate for that particular expression or it is not so not so appropriate. And that way, we slowly get into the third step, which is interpretation. And from the third step, we can then add a different kind of research if we feel that there are other additional information that will enrich our viewing. Then we look for that, and then we interpret it. And at the last step of the four steps, which is conclusion, that includes a lot of judgment. So conclusion part makes us evaluate the visual that we get to see. We do not do that at the first go. But then when it comes to the traditional artwork, which are not done in the conventional academic style, we have this general tendency of looking at it from a different perspective. Every time we try to understand the theme that is working as an operational factor behind making this painting, there are also reasons, and we need to understand that it's of course, like in today's context, we can always state that this is not the right way to view it, but there are certain reasons why people look at them. That's a very natural phenomenon that like if we go back and look into the history, we feel that those kind of traditional paintings which came into the form of narrative, they were made with a purpose, and the purpose was mostly to provide an alternative mean to the viewers, those who are not literate in a conventional sense. So it's almost like the paintings were made, the images were created to complement the literary texts which were written in some languages which are not practiced by the common people. So to make things work with everybody, to the common mass, there had been illustrations that was initiated. So because of that reason, what we see that the interpretation part is totally done on the basis of the theme. So even if the artwork is not very nicely done, or even there are suggestions which tells us very clearly that they're not following certain rule of painting, we ignore it for the purpose that those paintings are connected to a great story from some epic. It also had some religious connect. But in today's context, we cannot mercy on all those things. So, viewing folk and manner art is getting a new light, and that is positive in a different sense, that we are somehow respecting the individual expression, the individual understanding, and we are putting the artworks into a different pedestal. So let's view one of the artwork which is done in a recent time, as I discussed in our previous modules. Some of the artworks, some narrative scroll paintings from 17th or 18th century, even like late 18th and 19th century, 20th century Patachitras. This is something what is done in 2011, which is like just 5 years back. So it's very important to see when the contemporary mind, the artist of today's time, is depicting the same theme in the same style, in the same manner, and coming up with the same depiction of the age old saga, which is Ramayana again. As I mentioned earlier, also that I'm using a similar thematic content, and we have picked up Ramayana for the context, so that the story of Rama and Sita and Lakshmana, that is known to most of us, like that is already known, and that doesn't need to be described many a times. And then we can focus on the visual representation and the different stylistic variation that are available in our country. However, when we look at this particular artwork by M. Nagaraja from Srikalahasti, Andhra Pradesh, Chittoor district, what we see here is again the story of Rama and Lakshmana, Sita, the story of Ramayana, depicted in a single frame. So it's unlike the scroll paintings where the story goes in a horizontal or vertical format. Here the entire story is depicted in a single frame with some space divisions, but of course it's a ekachitra, or the single frame painting, but it's also a narrative painting where the story is told throughout, and the entire epic is put under one umbrella, that is a single frame. So I'll show the image and explain things into 3 different layers. Let me make that very clear in the beginning of the lecture, that these 3 layers are the semiotic layer, iconic layer, and the thematic layer. So in the semiotic layer, what we are going to emphasize on is totally regardless of its thematic content, which is the story and the background related to that. It's the emphasis on the use of space, the use of line, color, tone, texture, form, style and stylistic arrangements, influences, etc., etc. In the iconic layer, we are going to understand some of the images with their symbolic identity. So that will involve some additional information to it that is based on theme-based research. And then in the thematic layer, we are again trying to look at the story from its thematic perspective. So let's see the image and talk about it. So what we see here is the Ramayana, the Ekachitra painting done on a 4 by 6.5 feet scroll that has the entire story of Ramayana depicted into it. So when we describe the painting in the semiotic level, what we see here is the border that is painted with some decorative motifs which is repeated, and it's floral. It also has a bright red border, to hold the frame. The entire uh, composition is full of intricacy in terms of the figurations. The lines are very close with each other. It also has certain sense of symmetry into the composition that has uh, somehow held the entire dynamism that was provided by the symmetry of the storytelling that is there. And the pictorial problem is solved with a symmetrical arrangement of space, where we see that in the center there is one rectangle. The entire frame is rectangular with a continuous border, and then in the middle there's a smaller rectangle with another border which is also very prominent. So there are some serpent like formation which is somehow like making the area confined. At the same time, because of the similar stylistic identity of the images which are getting repeated all over, we can very clearly make out that this is not an isolated part of the painting, and that way the middle part, the center, is getting connected to the entire picture. So this is also relevant that the kind of color that is used here are also very restricted. So in this palette, what we are going to see is there's a yellowish base throughout, and there's another layer that is there in the background which is flat red. Previously we talked about the narrative scrolls of Bengal. We also talked about the charial paintings and other Patachitras like Matani Pacheri or Pabuji Ki Fad of Rajasthan and Gujarat. Everywhere we have seen that there's a Indian red or orange or reddish tint that is painted in the background, and they're painted in a flat order. So they do not show much of a spatial depth. When you see a warm color at the background which is flat, it suddenly doesn't absorb anything. So the backdrop in a way is quite bleak, and it doesn't penetrate much of a attention. So that gives it a two-dimensional quality throughout. At the same time, what you see in the picture, I'll show you the close-up and it will be easier for you to understand that there are certain borders which are passing through the entire frame in a horizontal order, and all those borders are off-white in color, and it has some Telugu script written on it. And there's a very interesting use of the Telugu scripture that tells the description of the stories, and suddenly, like, not the entire story but the different episodes of the story which is written in it. And the formation of those letters are also similar to the figurations. The images that are made has certain affinity with the letters, the fonts of the script. So that makes it all the more unified, and it gives us a very smooth spatial harmony throughout. The distribution of color is also, as we said, it has a restricted palette that has yellow, rust, indigo blue, and the special kalamkari black, which is not a peach black but it's a mixture of brown and blue that gives us a certain depth. And all the borders in the human figures and other recognizable images which are semi-abstract at the same time highly representational, they're all confined by the black border all over. That makes it look flat. At the same time, it also makes the narrative depiction much more clear to the viewer. So with those black borders and well defined contour, it becomes easier for us to understand the subject of the story and also the subject of the painting in a much better manner. So there are other space division that I must also mention. Like when we look at the painting at the first glimpse, we can always focus on the whole over the parts, and that is the beauty of this narrative, that our attention goes to the overall picture and then slowly it goes down to its different parts, and that way the entire viewing gets it takes place in a very smooth manner. So there are 4 square frames at 4 of the corners of the painting, that those are the key frames. There are also 2 rectangles on top and bottom of the center rectangle, which are slightly smaller than the center rectangular part. There are also 2 circular frames at the both side, that is in fact emphasizing the order, which is quite symmetrical in this artwork. So these are the key frames, and these are part of the narrative. At the same time, they are the highlighted parts of the whole story, and that is very important, where the artist is taking the liberty of skipping a few frames and highlighting a few very important and well known incidents which has a larger visual possibility to his favor, for his creative expression to take place and take place in an effective manner. So this is how the space is divided, and in between we see there are lots of images which are very intricate, but then they're repeated, and together the intricacy is adding to the balance of the entire large frame. So that is the beauty of the thing. Let's see some of the details and understand it better. So this is the frame that was there in the center, and what we see there, that it also has a diamond shape which is slightly stretched horizontally, and there are the centralized figures. One figure right at the center, which is the main character, and we'll come to the thematic reference in the next step. So what we see there is a blue which is very prominent, and the blue is also distributed in many different places in both the parts to give it a symmetrical balance. There's another shade of blue that is distributed at the 2 sides to balance with that. The border also has some emphasis on the same color, though the blue is contoured and bordered by the kalamkari black, the vegetable black. It also has some maroon, yellow, red, rust, and different tones of that. So there is one emphasis of yellow, ochre, orange, red, and most of the colors are the like warm shades, except for the blue that is there. So it's a colorful painting. At the same time, the colors are of a similar kind that gives it a very strong pictorial identity. We also see green in one part, that is in the lower half of the diamond, which is not very prominent, but it's also getting repeated at the corner of the diamond. It's just twice, and there's a scale change in that. What we see there is one figure, and the green is also made by mixing the blue dye with the yellow one that is existing in the picture. So that makes it all the more intriguing for the viewer to know the real identity of these characters, who they are and who they may be, because some of the prominent characters can be very easily identified if one is one belongs to the Indian culture, they belong to a part, or they're aware of the story. But many other characters are to be identified. There are also some religious symbols, some secular symbols here and there. There are flora, fauna, and other motifs which are highly simplified and decorative. And there are also some architectural facades, pillars, etc., to depict certain things in a very simplified and basic manner. Also, there's another thing that we must notice, that the figures from the both sides, they're facing towards the center to give it the symmetrical order. So all the figures are facing each other from both the side, except for the main figures, which are slightly larger in their size. So the figures at the center are the largest. That shows us a hieratic scaling that is also traditional. So if this is made in 2011, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, it doesn't go with a modern sensibility. So it's going towards certain order where the artist is using his freedom of depicting the images. At the same time, he is strictly adhering to the traditional principles, where the main characters has to be larger than the other characters, who are actually not physically small, but they're smaller in their importance, in their hierarchical positions. So all those things makes it all the more important and intriguing to look at. And also it's very important to see from this detail of the painting how the flatness is maintained here. So the artist made sure that the space doesn't get any kind of illusion of depth. So they are completely two-dimensional, and to maintain that, the artist had to put some effort to fill up the background almost everywhere. There are hardly any empty space that is shown throughout. So wherever there's some empty space, the artist made sure that he painted those parts with some maroon or rust or Indian red kind of a shade to give it a flat look, and that is keeping it much more decorative and two-dimensional throughout. This is the frame which was there at the beginning of the frame. If we go from the order which is left to right in the whole Ekachitra canvas. So here in this image, the borders are also very prominent. What we get to see is the different patterns in the borders, including the letters, which are the readable letters. Now, I would like to mention here that when I interviewed the artist, he said that those who can read Telugu will read it, and those who cannot can really they're not deprived of anything, because it's equally beautiful as a script and it can be simply enjoyed as a decorative pattern, which is very important to see that how typographic images also has the decorative identity that can add to the picture. So even if we feel that this is not readable for all viewers, it's highly iconic and culture specific, one has to understand the script and decipher it in terms of the knowledge. It's also very interesting to see how the figurations are matching with all those fonts. They have the similar roundity in its depiction. So everywhere they are clear contoured objects. The images are not very long in proportion, rather they're slightly dwarfish, and the proportion is also highly ideal and stylized. We never see a proportion which is close to a normal human proportion. Rather, they are the decorative forms that depicts the human identity in the figures, and that is also applicable when we see certain suggestions of water, or there are other elements also, stones and all, in the following frames. But everywhere the decorative quality is maintained. So in the beginning of the picture, we see that again there's a distribution of blue and the red background which is there, the flat background, and that is getting that is proceeding towards the from left to right. They're flat and continuous to connect the confined frame with the rest of the narratives. So that is another character that we discussed earlier, and it's getting repeated in almost throughout. Here we see the border again, with some zigzag lines, and it's a foliage which is known to be the creeper or lata. So it's a simplified form of the creepers that is a very common feature in all the Patachitra paintings in India. We see similar formations in the Patachitra of Odisha, but the angularities are more than this because they have a lot of Western Indian influence into it that made it a little more angular in their formation. In the roundish areas, we see some formation of the motifs which are often like the hamsa or the bird motif, and the negative positive ground is very well handled, where the images are looking slightly ambiguous. So there's a connection of a creeper and the form of a bird. So all the natural formations that are getting simplified here, we discussed about the Islamic influence in Kalamkari painting that didn't give it any kind of a Persian identity, but this was for sure that there had been a culture of looking at it from a simplistic perspective, where the natural objects were all brought down to a simplistic level, where the essence of the basic form were very effectively captured. And then in the figuration, we see that there's a simplified decorative order throughout. So we cannot call them decoration. It was in one point when Kalamkari tradition was going on, but making the identifiable figures which represent nature was not liked by the by the rulers who believed in Islam. But Kalamkari survived because of certain qualities which are not making it totally realistic. Though it was not patronized, but it survived and the practice was not totally prohibited. So it just got confined into a small zone, that is Srikalahasti, and Machilipattanam was totally taken over by the Muslim rulers who practiced Islam, and they gave them an alternative of using block prints and making things much more simplified. So what we see in the picture is the decorations in the borders. Even in the borders, there's no place which is in fact very empty. So wherever there's some negative space, they made sure that it's filled up with some decoration or the other. At the same time, the decorations are also continuous. In another picture, in another frame, which was at the bottom of the entire picture, that is another smaller rectangle, and we see the same happening going on. So there's a whole lot of scale change in all the images that makes it very important. So we'll see another frame and try to understand the quality of line in the picture. This is one frame where we are taking a closer look at the linear formation. So all the borders, the contours, the other lines that are meant to be lined, there's a linear emphasis everywhere. They're all done with some even manner. So we do not see much of a variation in the line. They're mainly the flat linear quality that is continuous. So it never tells us about the volume through the line. So lines are just the outline. It has got nothing to do with the natural rendering of light and dark, unlike the urban folk art of Kalighat Bhatt and other things that we are going to discuss in our following lectures. So it has some traditional identity, but the lines are there everywhere. There is no single thing which is not defined by a contour. So the lines are basically present here to delineate forms of all kind. In this frame, we see some interesting elements into it which are coming as some texture. So when we see the texture which is made with the repeated circle and lines on the blue, it gives us a sense of ripple on the ocean. Also, similarly, there are certain circles with some scratches on it, and those are the stones. Now, these are some symbolic uh, creation that is quite iconic, and we need to understand the identity of those objects with the knowledge of it. Otherwise, it's not having some, like, we cannot say that it has a certain resemblance with the natural elements, and it's easier for us to identify those objects as water and stone from, like, if we look at it from the naturalistic perspective. But they're symbolic, and one has to have the knowledge to decipher them. And there we need some guideline, and perhaps that is one reason why the episodes are described on the stories, which are taken from the story of Ramayana, and they are just the highlights that are there. And then there are other elements also which are actually very important, that there's a use of a speech bubble in one of the plays, which is not very traditional, because having a character using certain dialogues in the picture can be shown in many different ways. But here what we see is that the speech bubble is coming out from the character, and there are certain words which are written there that clearly tells us what is he uttering. So that is something which is very different here. There are other iconic forms where we need extra knowledge to understand that. We cannot decipher it totally from our common sense. Like, for instance, when we see that there's one human figure which is interacting with another bird, and the human figure has more than one head. So that's also another iconic identity that is there. So in the iconic level, we can always identify that this is one character which is different from the other human beings. He is Ravan, and he is the negative hero for the whole story, whereas on top of the frame it's the blue bordered Rama who is there. So all these iconic features clearly tells us about the characters, and many of the characters are not so well known to us, but there are certain iconic identity to each and every character that makes them different from the other character. Apart from a group of monkey soldiers that are there, so there are images of monkeys, the images of human beings, birds, also some abstract formation, the fonts, letters, and many other things that makes it very interesting. It's a combination of many different elements which are different in their stylistic identity, but at the same time, because of the uniformity of the line, tone, color, texture, and the application of all those things, it becomes quite unified. So we'll try to see this now from the thematic perspective.